Today I'm going to be learning about Swedish culture and in particular Swedish surnames. So this is about the development of Swedish surnames when the government makes you get a surname. So yeah, interested to see about this. I guess this is quite a niche subject to learn about, but I think that makes it even more interesting. So you can tell me if you know the origins of your surname and any other interesting things about Swedish surnames. Let's watch this and we can learn more.
In Sweden, back in the olden days, also known as the 1600s, your average Sven didn't really have a surname. There were some inherited family names placed after given names as we know them today, but they were borne by a relatively small section of the population. The nobility, especially the urader, or original nobility, often had adelsnamn, noble names, according to their noble house. Some of these date back as far as the 1300s, and many were based on the family crest. In the early to mid 17th century, the entire nobility adopted surnames to distinguish them from the filthy commoners, reflecting their status as the highest caste in Swedish society. Meanwhile, a lot of the clergy had lärdanamn, literally learned names, which had been in use since the Renaissance, and were thus inspired by the classics. They often ended in ander from Greek or us from Latin. In the latter case, the surnames would often have to agree with the natural gender of its holder. Us was after all a masculine ending, so the feminine a was preferred for women. A lot of the Latin-sounding names later dropped the us, leading to names ending in in or l. It's possible that this was done because of fashionability. People didn't want to be Lundinus anymore. They wanted to be Lundin, so it looked like their name came from French, which was much more fancy than Latin in the 1700s.
I mean, even that just little insight there is very interesting. I mean, can you imagine something like that happening today, changing surnames just to sound more French or more fancy? But again, like with the structure of these names, the clergy and the nobility, tell me if you have a surname that has any of these endings and if you knew of that origin.
But that's just a theory. Then there were the townspeople. Those who were more well off, like merchants, would often take surnames in imitation of the noblemen, possibly in order to imitate their status. These are known as borgerliga namn, bourgeois names. These were inspired by the noble names and learned names, but also by German family names, and importantly, place names. That's not to say that normal people all just had one name. As was common all over Scandinavia and beyond at the time, people tended to be referred to by their given name and a patronymic. A patronymic is a name formed from the name of your father, thus denoting whose child you are. For instance, if you take your average heterosexual Swedes, Lars and Karin, and they had a boy, Nils, he would be named Nils Larsson, contracted from Nils, Lars's son. And if they had a girl, let's say Sigrid, she would be named Sigrid Larsdotter, from Sigrid, Lars's daughter. What makes this different from those gendered surnames from earlier is that the next generation, say Nils's children, wouldn't carry this on as a family name. No, they would be called so-and-so Nilsson or so-and-so Nilsdotter. Another type of byname,
Yeah, just with that, is that not... Is that what happens currently? I think, is it Iceland have like a similar system for surnames? Maybe other countries in Scandinavia or Northern Europe, and I guess maybe other countries. I've seen this happen in different forms in other countries before. Tell me if you know of any of them. And tell me if you still have a name like that.
Associated especially with the Dalarna region of Sweden was gårdsnamn. These weren't placed after the given name, but before it, like in Chinese or Korean, and they were closer to family names than patronymics, in that they were usually inherited from generation to generation. Some of these were fossilized patronymics, with someone called Pers Johan not necessarily being the son of Pad, but having a male ancestor somewhere called Pad. Sometimes a man's ancestral name would actually be replaced with his wife's, like Ingrid's Johan, being a Johan who had gotten married to Ingrid. Other gårdsnamn were simply a person's profession, like Smed Johan being John the Smith, something we can also see as an origin for many English surnames.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. That we still see a lot of people have these names in the UK as well. My name, my real name, is like very Scottish. I'm not going to say what it is, but it's like one of those that has like the small letters, if that makes sense without giving it away. But yeah, mine's is like a very Scottish surname. This one I think has always found it quite interesting that named after a profession, but cool to see that is the same in Sweden as well.
There were also those called after the village they or their ancestors were born in, typically when that family had moved village. So in the village of Norse, there might be a family called Utby, because of their origins in the neighbouring village. though most famous are the bynames that were taken from farms. For instance, if there was a farm called Östgården, the family living there might be called Öst. Sometimes it's difficult to tell the difference between one of these and a fossilized patronymic, since a farm might be called Persgård, and then the family on that farm might be called Pers, even if they themselves had in fact bought the farm and were not descended from Per. But where this gets really interesting is that a lot of the time these bynames weren't just inherited by blood. Buying a farm can change your byname. Of course, apprentices could inherit the professional names of their masters. Families living on the same farm could all have the same byname without being blood relatives. Over in Iceland, they still use patronymics, or in the modern age, matronymics, but Swedish names are now pretty much all ancestral surnames. So how did these old naming systems disappear? In 1901, the Swedish government passed a law mandating fixed ancestral surnames for the entire Swedish population. Why? Well, one thing to remember is the rapid development of the state at this point in Scandinavian history. State records were becoming increasingly important, replacing traditional church records which would only record information within a certain parish. So having one standardized type of byname throughout the whole country is easier for centralized documentation. Sweden wanted to quote-unquote modernize. The Danes were doing it after all. In fact, Denmark had passed its first law making ancestral surnames compulsory all over the country in 1828. The many failures of this policy make up a whole story of their own, but it is likely that it had an effect on the Swedish authorities. The Swedish policy was far more successful, likely because many Swedes had already adopted surnames independently during the 19th century in a kind of natural transition. Many of the surnames that were assumed in the 1800s, and then after the law was passed in the early 1900s, were fossilized patronymics, though the dotter ending pretty quickly died out because, of course it did. And that's why there's so many Swedes with son names, and it's the same reason why so many Danes have sen names, and there's so many son names in English-speaking communities.
I actually never really thought about that. Yeah, there is a lot, but I always thought of that as a more Scandinavian, Northern Europe thing, but now that I see this, it makes complete sense. Why have I never really considered that's where that originates from? But I know more, like, because obviously I know football, like Henrik Larsson, all these like Swedish footballers who have like these surnames where I recognise them from. But yeah, interesting to see that still being kept in Sweden.
Communities.
That's kind of
in fact, there were too many son names. This wasn't as much of a problem as sen names were in Denmark at the time, but it was still difficult to keep track of everyone in this rapidly changing world when there were so few names. Nearly 3% of those listed in the 1901 Swedish telephone registry had the surname Andersson. So then came a period in the first half of the 20th century where Swedes changed their surnames like crazy. Part of this was probably because of their own experiences in an increasingly urbanized Sweden. Being confused for the other Lars Andersson in Stockholm for the third time this week would probably make anyone consider changing that annoying frozen patronymic to something more unique. And of course, from the government's perspective, the point of making everyone get surnames in the first place was for easier documentation, so unique surnames were all the better for them. They encouraged this practice by making changing your name much easier, and even publishing official state books of surname suggestions. The first of these being the 1921 Svensk namnbok till vägledning vid val av nya släktnamn, Swedish Namebook, for guidance at choosing of new family names. So loads of purely made-up surnames turned up in the 1900s in Sweden. Several branches of my own family changed their names in this period. One part of my ancestry changed their names from Pettersson to Vernulf. This name is, linguistically speaking, ridiculous. This W was not used at the time in Swedish orthography, making the name look German in origin, but German doesn't use this letter. Like Swedish, it uses this symbol instead, making this look more like it might be an antiquated Danish name. But what on earth does Van mean? Is this supposed to be from Dutch? Middle English? The answer is it doesn't have a meaning. My great-granddad and his brothers made it up.
I mean, that's even better. Like, I mean, to get, like, if you want a unique name, that's what you got to do, man. Just go completely mad and just make up any old thing. But it looks like a super cool name. If I had a Swedish person with that surname, I'd be, like, quite impressed. It sounds good. It looks good. At that time, yeah, can you just imagine this was, like, part of culture at that time? Everybody just changing their surnames, making up anything. Just can't imagine that happening today. And the fact it's like encouraged by the government, providing pamphlets and guidance on how to do that or what to do. It's like quite a cool time, actually.
It's a fairy tale name, and there's loads of people in Sweden walking around with this kind of gibberish surname, and you know what? I think that's cool. Of course, the policy was never going to be a complete success. I mean, the government needed, or rather wanted, a standardized way of recording names, and it's not exactly a coincidence that they chose the way already used by the nobility and the rich. In the communities that were unused to after names, which were almost entirely rural and generally quite poor, like in Dalarna, where gårdsnamn were the main style of surname, the 1901 law was met with resistance. In fact, some of them continued to fight it for over a century, and laws protecting the use of gårdsnamn were finally enacted in 2016. Wow, isn't it interesting how much local culture and tradition is lost with the creation of the modern state and how the cultural practices of the rich and privileged are prioritized over those of other communities? I mean, nah, what am I saying? Let's not get political here.
Very good, man. That's an excellent video, man. Brilliant video, man. That was like so informative, funny, very eye-opening. Like, not just learning about Swedish culture, Swedish history as well. And yeah, I wonder, like, for Swedish people, if you've not seen this video before, like what you think about that. Did you learn about that? Have you ever thought about your surname? Like as I said, my real Scottish name is has some different meanings when it's broken down. It's quite long, very Scottish. Maybe one day I'll go over that. But yeah, tell me about if you know the origins of your name. If you've got a unique name, you don't have to say it, but tell me what you think about it. Did you know anybody with like interesting, funny names at school, anything like that, or at work, or all that? Yeah, tell me what you think about this one, and go subscribe to that channel. Very well produced video. Thanks.